Welcome to this exciting webinar addressing the Swedish IoT security challenge. We're going to listen. My name is Leif Häggmark and I'm the chairman of Dataföreningen in Sverige. We're going to listen to Åhlund from Luleå University of Technology, Gustav Söderlind, MSB, Haydn Povey, Secure Thingz, and John Moor, IoT Security Foundation. And after the talks, we will have a panel discussion where also Olle Bergdahl from IoT Sweden is taking part. So welcome everybody, and over to Christer.
Yeah, thank you, Leif. So my name is Åhlund. And let's see, I just like to share my screen. There it comes. Perfect.
If you just wait, Christer, I forgot to mention the questions. You see in the tool, you have a button called questions, and during the talks, you can fill in your questions there, and also tell if you direct your question to a specific person, and I will then take up those questions in the panel discussion. Sorry, Christer.
No worries. Yeah, so my name is Åhlund, and I work as professor in pervasive mobile computing at Luleå University of Technology. Pervasiveness comes from we have information and communication technologies in our surroundings, more or less despite our location, and they might be visible or they might be hidden. The mobility part comes from that we have devices being mobile, we as users are mobile. Computation and storage is mobile, we can place it in different locations, and we often connect wirelessly. Our background into this and why we are attending and think that this is extremely important and interesting is that we see that a technology like Internet of Things is becoming a key technology when digitalizing societies, industries, etc. And due to that, some time ago, we started a center for critical infrastructures and social security addressing this, where we both look at the technology as such and how we build systems, and combine with how we as humans perceive the systems and how we make use of them and how we secure them. As a result of that, we took part in a working group at IoT Sweden that worked on to see how the projects now within IoT Sweden, how do we address the security and what are the challenges that we face. What we saw then is that we mainly focuses on the problem domain to be solved by the technology. And we forget about the security. Not a concept that we forget, but we see that there's something that we can add on at the end, which usually doesn't provide a good enough security solution. So we identified then in that work that security by design is becoming more important, and we need clear guidelines in how to handle the security. Today, we are working with a working group at Cybernode. Cybernode also looking at, our working group looks at IoT security specifically. So that is what we are working today. If we then look at what does it mean to maintain this huge number of devices that needs to be secured over time, supporting us in different services and applications. And just to show you a bit of the importance of being aware of what can be identified in our systems, I just want to quickly show you Shodan, that is a search engine. This one is a crawler, it goes around the internet, randomizes IP addresses and randomizes ports to look into. So This is like opening your door to a house to see what is in the house. And when you do that, we get the response through a banner. And the banner tells a lot about what system that is executing behind the port. So just quickly show you a few cases how it can look. So if I say that in Sweden, I want to see if there are any webcams connected, and then I get a response. There are some webcams that we can inspect and have a look at if we like. Might be that owners are aware of that this is broadcasted or might not be. Another example is that if we have the awareness of some sort of vulnerability, we can ask to search for that vulnerability. So do we have any heartbleed vulnerabilities in Sweden? Systems that hasn't been updated, and you see this is from 2014, so it's a quite old one. So we can, for instance, inspect this IP address and say, okay, we have a vulnerability. This one has not been, the firmware hasn't been updated probably. We can have a look at another system. And if we look at that, okay, there are a number of vulnerabilities. So this system needs to be maintained and updated to avoid existing threats about the system. So just to show you what is visible quite easily for us to search on different IoT devices. And that brings up the need of addressing this IoT security challenge and see naturally what can we do to improve how we maintain and make our system secure. So that is all from me. So now over to MSV.
Thank you. Well, I have some technical problems, so I will not be able to show you some slides, but I will just talk through some of the points. So my name is Gustav Söderlind, and I come from the unit for security in cyber physical systems. And by that we mean those IT systems that affect the real world, such as traffic lights, power production, power distribution, water production, and increasingly IoT as well. And we produce guidelines on how to implement security in these systems, and we provide support. And the issue we see with IoT is that it's doing the same journey that IT and industrial control systems used to do. That the systems are built and then they realize, okay, but we are exposed on the internet. And suddenly we are vulnerable. And then security is an add-on, and that is never as secure as thinking of security from the start. So I was just gonna start with discussing some of the challenges and some of the risks that we see. This is of course not a completely comprehensive list, but just some samples. To begin with the risks, we see that there is a problem with confidentiality and integrity where an antagonist can decide to use weak IoT security as a stepping stone. So you access the IoT system in order to get into the system that's using it. So that becomes the weak door into a more valuable system. Or indirectly, you actually use the IoT, as we saw here, webcams or something, to compromise integrity. You listen to someone, you use the sensors, you use the cameras, you use the microphones, you abuse them basically. Another issue is integrity. For instance, if you select the IoT as the target, for instance, if you have IoT playing the role of sensors or some component in sensors, then you can disrupt the system by feeding it false data. We've had many cases where sensor systems have malfunctioned, and that has resulted in catastrophic failures in dams and such. You can also imagine what happens when we have these smart meters, if someone takes control over a large number of those and tries to manipulate the grid. Another issue is availability of the services or of the IoT sensors themselves. You can imagine what would happen if an IoT unit is rendered inoperable, either because that's the purpose of the attacker or just as a side effect of some other malicious activity. And finally, the issue of the connectivity layer, because many of these speak through wireless. And we see a proliferation of jammers, cheap jammers available on the internet. So this is something you always have to think about. How reliable are the communication links that I'm using to my IoT devices? Or in worst case, if you have HPM weapons, because these devices usually run on very low voltages, so they are extra susceptible to disruption of the internal circuitry from high energy pulses. A case on the availability, we have seen some cases where you have smart fridges in supermarkets and people have just shut them off from the internet, possibly by accessing Shodan and finding them. What happens if you have, for instance, IoT systems in fridges in a hospital and you cannot rely on that an intrusion into the hospital has not affected them? You don't know if someone has manipulated the temperature settings. Then you would have to get rid of all the vaccines, all the blood. And that is if you're aware of it happened. Some of the challenges, security challenges we see inherent in IoT is the complexity, because we see all these vendors, all these multiple protocols, hardware, software models. It's very hard to keep grasp on the systems, how the systems look, the vulnerabilities. Inherent in many of these devices is the design restriction, the balance between the primary purpose and adding on security, because you have limited processing power, limited energy resources. So this is a very delicate balancing. How do you do patch handling? And if you do a software update, in some cases that could consume your entire battery supply, which would be a good way to sabotage a system if someone did it maliciously. And many of these systems can be physically exposed, which introduces a new level of threat. What can you do when you have the device in your, in your possession? What can you learn? How can you access the backend systems through that? So this is just a short list of issues that I think are important to have in the back of the head when you're thinking about IoT. I think I will stop there for now. Thank you.
So then over to Haydn.
Hi, my name's Haydn Povey. I'm CEO of Secure Things, an IAR systems company, and I'm also a founder member and on the executive steering committee for the IoT Security Foundation. In this brief presentation, I want to look at some of the threat landscapes and best practices for IoT systems around consumer electronics, but also more broadly. So what are the evolving security challenges? Well, first of all, security is seen as the leading barrier to adoption in general, with many people stopping or halting adoption based on lack of security, and people saying they would buy more IoT if security was better. That's not hard though, because we only see about 4% of consumer IoT devices including sufficient security. And this is largely driven by a lack of legislation and regulation. Again, underpinning this is really a lack of knowledge and capability, with currently about 3.5 million cybersecurity jobs unfilled globally. But having said all this, we do see that organizations are moving from why do I need security to how do I implement security and how do I start around that. There are three core requirements which are happening in the industry. The first is inhibiting malware, and I think that this is obvious, but it really comes into focus when we think about critical infrastructure, whether it's ransomware, general malware, cyber physical attacks. The recent events on the global stage are really sharpening our defensive requirements here. We see it around attacks previously on water treatment works with contamination, electrical distribution networks and grids, as well as transportation systems. And this is just something we need to focus on. But similarly, there is also the need for reducing IP theft. The EU estimate that there's a 60 billion euro impact based on cyber theft of intellectual property, and accounting for nearly 300,000 jobs. But we also need to enable a supply chain of trust. It's estimated that counterfeiting and cloning is $500 billion a year industry. And of course, electronics is actually the core value in that very, very large number. Because of this, we are seeing a number of requirements come through. And recently, we supported a call from the World Economic Forum looking at what are the core requirements. And we have 5 here: universal default passwords, software updates, secure communications, ensuring protection of personal data, and a strong vulnerability disclosure platform. Now, these are all actually based back on the ETSI standard 303645, but that itself is actually based on the work that the IoT Security Foundation has been delivering now for about 7 years. If we look at the consumer IoT legislation for the EU and the UK, a lot of this is, as I said, being driven by the IoTSF, working with governments around the world. In the first instance, we helped and supported ETSI, the European Telecom Standards Institute, on their delivery of the EN 303645 standard. And this was based on what we call the 13 best practices that the IoTSF evolved very early on. Now, these are regulatory guidelines. We are seeing legislation come through from the EU with ENISA, looking at introducing formal legislation in the next 24 months for products sold. Now, that actually means that devices need to be designed today if we're going to hit shipping and manufacturing and other logistics issues. In fact, it's almost impossible to get chips delivered in less than 12 months today. So that covers half of the time period to the legislation hitting. Moving a little bit forward, the UK government via the DCMS, the department there, and the National Cybersecurity Centre have implemented Secure by Design legislation, and this is going through its final formal legislative step as the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Bill. And this is now going to introduce a £10 million or 4% global revenue fine for devices which don't hit the baseline best practices. So what does that look like? Well, the PSTI Infrastructure Bill covers all internet connectable devices and requires that all devices must have unique passwords, must ensure vulnerability disclosure to customers for a given time, and be able to be patched and updated against vulnerabilities. And if you don't achieve those, you're obviously subject to this very large fine. These requirements have come out of Europe, but they are also international, being picked up by many different organizations. In the US, the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act was delivered about 12 months ago, and this required NIST to basically call on the same 13 best practices requirements, and there's a strong alignment there. Similarly, in India, Australia, Singapore, and others, we see those 13 best practices being picked up, and in other major economies, very similar legislative requirements are coming through. So what are the 13 best practices? Well, the top 4 here, or 5, are actually the most critical ones. No default passwords, vulnerability disclosure, keeping software updated, really is key, critical to everything that we do as an industry. Beyond that, we think we should be securely storing credentials, communicating securely, and these top 5 echo the World Economic Forum call. And then there's many others which are application dependent. And we at the IoTSF have been very involved in driving that. There are, of course, other areas, and these are things which we're looking to help with as well. For example, in industrial IoT, the IEC 62443 is very prevalent, but it does cost about $10,000 to get access to these requirements. We think that we can basically help people with a lot of those fundamental requirements throughout their system, although we're in no way competing with the IEC, and in fact it is a partner organization. The nice thing about the IEC is that it does define a number of security levels, ranging from configuration errors all the way up to, in effect, the nation-state attacks on the critical infrastructure, and defines the requirements that we need to have in there. Now, what we'll see in all of these is that we need to have security made simple, and it needs to cover the entire life cycle of the product, from design to deployment in our terms. So looking at the secure development, how we develop protection profiles, secure boot and device management, how we do secure production, pre-production, production releases, and true high-volume production off-site with third parties who are not necessarily trustworthy themselves, and of course the secure lifecycle, and that includes now how we integrate with the clouds and how we manage updates. All of these areas are things that the IoTSF is looking for partners to help deliver on.
And then we need to make security made simple. We need to ensure that we address the technical issues, confidentiality, integrity, availability, authentication, and so on. We have to make sure that we deliver the capabilities that we need in our products against counterfeit, against IP protection, against malware injection. And of course, we need to impact the right outcomes, whether this is integration with the Security Operations Center, feature enablement, access management, and more. All of these aspects can be made simple if they're started correctly and if we basically look to follow those 13 best practices. Thank you very much for your attention in this presentation, and I'll now hand over to John Moor. Thank you.
Hello, I'm John Moor, and I'm the Managing Director of the IoT Security Foundation. I'm delighted to be talking to you about a challenge that I've been focusing on with many colleagues and friends for the last 7 years, and that is the wicked challenge of IoT security. In particular, I want to introduce you to the work of the IoT Security Foundation, why we're here, what we aim to do, how we've been doing that, and what we plan to do next. And after all of that, I hope that enough of you here today will be interested to join what I call the super blue team of defenders and help make the new digital world that we're entering in continually to be a safer place for you, for society, industry, our institutions, and our economies. My fellow speakers have set out, in brief summary, the status of where we are today, including the threat landscape and recent developments. Yet to help you understand why IoTSF exists, I need to take you back to 2015, when I first started looking at the status of IoT security. Indeed, I think it was perhaps more accurate to say IoT insecurity. On the slide, you'll have seen some headlines that we gathered at the time, and you'll have seen instances of concerns around baby monitors, traffic light systems, routers, domestic appliances, cars, and more. So we really got a sense that there was an invasion of IoT, and unfortunately at the time, the security status was egregious. Egregious meaning very, very bad indeed, and something needed to be done. Manufacturers must do better. So something had to be done to coordinate efforts to address the many threats of connected technologies. So on September the 23rd, 2015, in response to what we saw as many concerns, we launched the IoT Security Foundation, and we launched it with a very simple mission, and that was to make it safe to connect in the era of IoT by helping to secure the Internet of Things. Today, I'm pleased to tell you that IoTSF has more than 150 members and includes well-known brands from the United States, Europe, China, India, and beyond. Together, we've created an expert community where we work on activities all designed to improve the security posture of the entire IoT ecosystem. So, for example, we promote awareness and promote a security mindset. We produce many best practice materials and tools to help vendors and users of IoT technologies, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. We also work very closely with the international standards efforts to make sure that they include the right things in their standards. As a result, we also influence and consult on cybersecurity regulations, and of course we have an annual conference, we do many meetings and networking events. In recent years, we've started to look at funded collaborative projects with our members, and this last point is absolutely crucial. IoTSF remains objective and impartial. Although we have many corporate members, we are vendor neutral. So I'm going to quickly run through some of those publications we've produced to date. And I want to start with one of our most popular downloads aimed at developers and manufacturers. And this is the Assurance Framework. It's a comprehensive design document. It covers the life cycle from design to disposal. And it includes aspects relevant to different design and management teams. We believe this is a pre-compliance resource that is mapped also to a number of common international standards. When I say a pre-compliance, what I mean is that if you look at some of the standards, in particular the one that Haydn mentioned earlier, ETSI 303645, you'll find that there are something like 13, in fact it is 13 security requirements. Within the framework, we have more than 270 requirements which help to satisfy those 13 elements. Not all of them are mandatory, but we break it down into more detail so that if you use the framework, then you can comply with ETSI 303645 and, as you'll see later, maybe NIST 82592. We also produce awareness reports and white papers. So here, for example, on subjects such as vulnerability disclosure, a white paper on smart buildings, and a 2018 report on international regulation. In some situations, we've also opted to produce materials as examples of simply what good looks like, such as a series of architecture documents in different settings. Here, we're looking at a hub-based approach in the home, in the enterprise, and we also have a healthcare setting too. Now, this is a slide that I take immense pride in presenting back to our members on any occasion I can, for example, an audience such as this, as it really shows us, demonstrate the impact of our work and the popularity of our downloads. So since we've been counting, and across approximately 15 publications, I'm pleased to tell you that we've had over 47,000 downloads. The top 3 of those downloads over time have been our assurance framework, our secure design best practice guide, and also our very first publication, the principles document, which we published back in 2016, I think. Now, those are the most popular over time. The principles document, for example, last time I counted, it was something like 50 downloads last month, and there were other publications that are ranking up higher numbers than that. But because it's been here so long, it still takes a place in the top 3 ranking. Now, here are some examples of where our work is referenced, and as I mentioned, we are pre-compliant, so we lead the discussion. We're ahead of where the standards are with our best practice guidance. I'm delighted to tell you that we are referenced in the ETSI 303645 standard. That's in Europe, and by the way, that is being adopted globally, many instances of where that is being used. If we take the US example for NIST, and in particular 8259, we're also referenced in that document. And the third one I've put in there, the IoT Security Landscape Report, which is really interesting because that report is a very, very comprehensive and thorough report. And if you have time and inclination, I do recommend that you read it. I think it was produced in 2019. It was produced, commissioned by both the Dutch and the Singaporean governments, and we feature pretty heavily in there. And of course, we have a very healthy relationship with the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. Now then, standards often lead into regulatory aspects. We've been leading that awareness with our members for some time. As I mentioned, we did a report on forthcoming regulation back in 2018. That regulation is coming to fruition now, and in particular here, even here in the UK, we believe that by the end of this year there will be a product security and telecoms infrastructure bill come into effect, something that IOTSF has been asked to provide on many occasions evidence into. But for our members and for the general IoT ecosystem, we also produce webinars and guidance advice, and you can download these materials from our website. So that was a really quick run through, and it doesn't come close to the amount of activity that's been happening since we were formed 6.5 years ago. So our summary status, and we discussed this at the board level, we believe we've been doing great. We really have. We've been helping to shine a light on this very tricky and complicated subject of IoT security. But it's not enough. We want to do more. We need to do more. So we asked ourselves, how do we do that? How do we further make it safe to connect? How can we proliferate IoT security best practice around the globe in every corner and every facet of where it is used? And we concluded that we needed to bring more people into the Super Bleed team. So we decided that we would go global. Now, global is a mix of a word called global and local. And fundamentally what it means is what you have is local interests expressed globally. So that's what we're looking to do. We want regional impacts, interests, and we want to have global impact. And as you can see from the butterfly diagram on the left here, which we've used from Beecham Research, it shows you the world of IoT and where every single one of those boxes has a impact on IoT security, and we need to cover more of that. Now, we're not going to do that at the rate and the pace that we've been working, so we really do need to bring more activity into the fray. Because of that, we announced last June to our members that we were interested to create regional chapters. Now, I'm delighted to tell you that by the time we got to the end of 2021 and just socializing this idea with our members, we were in actual fact ready to establish our very first chapter, and that was in Bucharest. just last week at our plenary members meeting, we had an update from Bucharest, and their clear focus is to look at the industrial Internet of Things. However, we need more. We need many more. So we're also now looking at what we do next, and we're asking ourselves, where will our next chapter come from? Could it be Sweden? I hope so. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. Let's move on and get into the discussion.
So then we start the panel discussion, and we have some questions. And I think we start with a question to Olle, since you didn't present anything today. What can IoT Sweden as a strategic innovation program contribute with related to IoT security?
Thank you, Leif, and thank you all presenters. Truly interesting and a truly important subject concerning creating a trust in IoT environments that is absolutely necessary and crucial to be able to get values from investments in IoT solutions. It's really important for the whole society, I believe. I representing a national strategic innovation program, and that's IoT Sweden. And one of our missions is to use, or what can I say, strengthen Swedish competitiveness, and also strengthen the capabilities for municipalities and cities around Sweden using IoT for societal challenges. And we are doing that by financing and funding innovation projects and also strategic projects around Sweden. And I think one of our most important thing is to strengthen and increasing the awareness of security, and also supporting knowledge to be shared about around the whole ecosystems and the partners, whether you are a manufacturing the hardware or developing the software, whether it's academia or the city or local administration. I think knowledge is one of the key elements, and what we can do is that we can creating seminars, and we can also stress the importance of dealing with the security by design. And I think that this thing that was mentioned before, security made simple, that principle or such, that we can highlight that and integrate it into our projects. That is one of the most important things. Security, no single organization can deal with this or making these capabilities or securing the systems by themselves. Collaboration is needed, and collaboration is one key elements of what we are dealing with. So the innovation and collaboration, I would say.
Okay, Christer, what are the biggest challenges when it comes to IoT security?
That's a big question. So it goes all the way from that when we start to, and that's a big challenge, I guess, when we start to develop a system, comes from selecting the right chipsets, using trustworthy open source libraries if we're using open source, getting to think about IT security from the first chip mounted or the first software line written. And we need to get that into our minds. But it also reaches all the way up until how we make use of the systems as users. And I think we as users are a weak spot in that, that we sometimes lack the knowledge of how to secure systems. A lot of IoT devices are so simple to install, and they are pre-configured for us to be up running very quickly. And with that, we are happy, and the Thingz is operating as it should. But with that also, we don't get the awareness of how to maintain the security, how to keep it secure. And it has been mentioned already, just the hazard of default users and default passwords that has been shown to be a real big vulnerability to a number of systems. So it was a bit wide response to a short question. It goes all the way.
Gustav, do you have any security advice for those who buy IoT products?
Well, the simplest would be collaborate with other buyers and get the competence to set the requirements. So have this, be aware of what security requirements you have on the systems. Collaborate with others, do a risk analysis on the systems. What will they be used for? What will be the consequences if they fail? What are the mitigation efforts you can make? And lastly, but not least, test. Always test the systems. Use them in exercises, so you are sure on what they do and their capabilities. I'm sure there are other, but those are those who come to mind. Collaborate, be aware of what requirements you set on them.
Okay, Haydn, I understand the need, but how do I start to implement EN 303645 into my products?
It's a great question. I think as we look back at the presentation I just gave, I think there are those 3 or 5 key capabilities that we have to have. The good thing is security done early is security done easily, or security made simple. So as you start to design new devices, it really is the time to get security engaged. So making sure that you have that robust root of trust, which can support a secure boot framework, which can support the identity, and obviously gives anchors to authentication and authorization and those sort of capabilities. The other key capability that we have to have, obviously, for all of the legislation frameworks is the ability to update. We have to presume that the bad guys will always win at some level. We're human, we write code, and that code will always have some holes in it. So we have to presume the bad guys will find vulnerabilities. So 2 things. First of all, you have to have a mechanism for sharing those vulnerabilities, those CVEs. It's not something we should be ashamed of. It's just part of the digital world. But we then have to have the relationship with our customers where we can then deliver updates. As part of IAR, we're a premium tools vendor for writing software, but it doesn't stop with the first release. There have to be, lots of future releases with versioning, with anti-rollback, and with all of those capabilities in there. So it's good practice. It's not necessarily really new, but applying it to this scale for the IoT is something that we all have to do together.
Thank you, Haydn. I'm informed that we have 3 people taking part of the webinar that had audio issues. So we are recording the webinar, and we will send out a follow-up email with the link to the recording, so that you could listen once more afterwards. So John, you mentioned that IoTSF is involved in some collaborative projects. Can you tell me a bit more?
Yeah, I'm very happy to, thank you. So as I mentioned that when we started IoTSF, we still have a very broad mission. That gives us a lot of latitude. So the early activities that we focused on, because it was clear that there were so many things to do, we had to prioritize, we had to make sure we honed in on the most acute issues as we saw. And what that meant is that we looked at things like the framework and the best practice guides to really help raise awareness and shine a light on this thing called insecurity. And what we're doing today, actually, in a very short session, is something that we did back in the early days, over several months, even the early years. But we've always had ambition to do much more than that. Indeed, when I first started looking at IoT in security, because I come from the semiconductor industry and we're always looking at the advanced stuff, my first inclination was to jump in and look at things like side channel attacks, so non-invasive techniques to see what sort of encryption systems we're using. But it became very clear that actually there's no point in doing those things until you get the basics right first. So we've always had this ambition to do more and to do more advanced stuff as well as the fundamental stuff. So a couple of years ago, I socialized amongst our members our interest to perhaps form some collaborations and maybe apply for some innovation funding. I'm delighted to say that we did actually do that. We got a small company, a large company, a research institute, and IoTSF to come together to apply for some innovation funding, which we got. We won that. So that small company was a company called Inquiring Minds, who focused on artificial intelligence and security. The large company was Cisco. The research institute was the University of Oxford, and of course IoTSF. And what we did is we prioritized where we wanted to do that research. If you look at most of the threat landscape reports and where a lot of the hacks are going on, you tend to find there are two devices that are targeted more than any other, and that is webcams and the router. Now, the router is actually a special case. It's much more important to fix the router than it is the webcam. They're both important, of course, but the thing about the router is you've got many things attached to it. So we created a project called Many Secured with those founding partners. We have a special interest group which is formed around it, and together we help identify the elements for the next generation secure routers, where we try to address some of the emerging issues and fix some of the problems that we have, and I'll mention those in a moment. So we look at those things, and what the group does, it produces specifications, it produces open source software, and we've got some proof of concepts. But the sorts of things that we're looking to achieve in that project that I'm talking about is, how do we do updates at the speed and at the scale that the technology is moving? I was on a session not too dissimilar to this about 6 months ago with a number of other foreign agencies, and I won't mention the specific names, but I was told that the local authority worked with the telecoms companies, and when they noticed something on a domestic network which looked a bit suspicious, what that would do was flag up a query, and then the telecoms operator would write a letter and say, we think you've got something dodgy on your network. And I thought, that's fantastic. The problem is it's a very manual process, it doesn't scale, and it's very slow. What if we could do that at the router? I think we can, and Many Secured is the project. Now that's one project. We want to do more. We think there's lots of opportunity to do more. And so indeed, if we get to the point that there's a chapter in Sweden, I think that's one of the areas that we would encourage. You know, we've already got a research institution there with Krista. There's a great organization, IoT. Let me see if I can get this right. You'll forgive me, I'm native English, of course. So IoT Sweden are represented here. So we've got
Thank you.
a number of the bodies that need to come together. And you know, let's be clear about this. What's great about this work is that it's non-profit. We don't have shareholders. everything goes back. So it is a really good use of public funding. So we want to do more. We can do more. We're looking at several other opportunities, but we want more activity around the globe and local groups working on local issues and make better use of those funds, which means obviously the local region benefits too. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, John. Olle, what are the top IoT security challenges facing Swedish cities?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think there are several challenges, and among the top ones, I will bring in competence. It's very difficult to recruit competence needed to deal with the security issues. And I think you need to integrate the work with cybersecurity and have a holistic perspective dealing with this. That means that staff that working with procurement, for example, need to be skilled and dealing with this taking this into consideration, procuring IoT solutions, and also staff that are working in the IT department with maintenance. They need to be aware of the security is a moving target. That means that the whole product life cycle, so to speak, as we have seen today, products need, the solution itself needs to be constantly updated, and that is requires a specific skill set and knowledge to deal with. Truly important. And also the end user, how can they understand whether or not the solution itself is secured, and how can we trust the IoT data? So it's also a matter of trust. And one other very key challenge is about, I would say it's about using the already existing best practice, as we've seen today as well. There are framework, there are very good news. I mean, there are some best practices around there. So instead of inventing something new, better using that knowledge that is already existing. Of course, even more can be done. But for example, the Swedish Association of Local Authority and Regions, they have gathered some framework and some very good tools, I would say, to working with the risk analysis, and also moving from risk and how to mitigating these risks with different capabilities. It could be technical, it could be human aspects, it could be behavioral aspects. So the reusing of already existing best practices and frameworks, it could be from IoT Security Foundation and elsewhere. I think that is crucial, and also learning from each other. That is one of the top challenges. And if we can move on with increasing awareness, be better to reuse already existing knowledge, and collaborating, I think that is very good thing to start with, I would say. Thank you.
Christer, where do we find information about existing threats and how to stay updated?
Yeah, when it comes to vulnerabilities, there are some databases regarding common vulnerabilities and exposures. And there is one called cve.org, for instance, that I would recommend. But then it's also about being alert, keep updated. There are a lot of web pages that you say documents and tells about exploits. And if one looks at cve.org, they have documented what is known by us. So what have you seen before? But we also have the zero-day exploit, that is a new vulnerability that we haven't seen before, and that spreads extremely quick. So keeping updated on different forums, and it's hard just to pinpoint one, but I can recommend the cve.org, especially if we look at, when I showed them and we looked at the vulnerability, the ones that was listed there, 2014, 16, 17, they are definitely in the cve.org database. So that's a low-hanging fruit to recommend.
Thank you. We just have 5 minutes left of our webinar, and I think we should sum up. So do you want to sum this up, Christer?
First, thanks for all attending the webinar, and especially thanks for people in the panel and presenting, and also you, Leif, for the team helping us to set this webinar up. So the intention with this, I mean, when we look at cybersecurity, especially IoT security, we have a lot of activities ongoing. And what we want to do with this is to find a consolidation in our activities, that we meet up, that we join forces to become a bit stronger in doing that. And that's the reason for this call, for us to meet. And there exists a lot of standardization organizations that looks at security. Might be tricky for everyone to understand, and that is why best practices are so important. They are usually easier to grasp and easier to deploy than to look at standards. Then, of course, we need to balance between what is standardized and what are the best practices. But I think that best practices is a way to go for us to gain increased experience and knowledge in this. And as we have seen, IoT Security Foundation have a number of best practices that I like myself when reading them. We also have Swedish initiatives like Svenska Statsföreningen that has vägledning. Now it will be Swedish, so sorry John and Haydn, but it's called vägledning för robust och säker IoT. So we have that is comes from NISA, and then that was transformed into Swedish and a bit easier understood text. So and we have, for instance, you mentioned Olle, we have Klassa from Sveriges kommuner och regioner, and we have also what you call the reference architecture that is being worked on now in to provide a guideline how to build IoT systems in the public sector. So there are a number of parallel activities, but myself and I see that since I'm now looking into if we can establish some sort of joint activity in this, see that if we can join these forces, we'll be even stronger. And we should also make use of what already exists, so to avoid reinventing the wheel. So what's out there, how do we compile that, and how do we make that available for others to use? So that's a part of this initiative. So due to that, we are looking into to see if we can collaborate with IoT Security Foundation, establishing a chapter in Sweden where we both can contribute but also gain increased knowledge of what they have done. So that is why we are now calling for an action to see, is there an interest among you out there that attends the webinar, and hopefully others as well, but we need to start somewhere, and that is why we start with this webinar. So yeah, so I guess that's for my roundup. I don't know if someone else wants to add to that.
Could I just add a few words, Krista? I think it's come out very strongly in the whole webinar. Collaboration is so important. There's no one company, one government, one individual organization that is going to fix the many existing and evolving threats that we have. So we have to join forces, and that's why I often talk about the super blue team. We have to collaborate. Everybody's got something to contribute, and together we are better, we are stronger. And that's the whole purpose of what we're trying to do. And I really, look forward, hopefully, to working with new colleagues in Sweden and, sharing our strengths and sharing the workload. So as you've said, Krista, the big call to action here is that people on the call, if you agree with what we say and you have interests, that's the other important thing, your interests. What we're trying to do is align it with your professional interests and your company interests. It's okay to have those in mind. We're not a charity. We understand the economics, how that works. So if you want to get involved to help your business, to help your professional development, and to help the progress of IoT security globally, then we implore you, please get in touch with Krista. Let him know that you'd like to be part of the chapter. And I very much hope that we'll be hearing a lot more from Sweden in our activities as we go forwards. So thank you.
And thank you to all you that took part of this webinar. And if you're interested, send your emails to Krista. And remember to use the subject IoT SF chapter, since Krista gets lots of emails, so we need to sort them some way. Thank you very much, and that concludes the webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks.